I've got a very interesting story here of a Christian who deconverted, lost his faith, and then later reconverted back. So let me tell you who it is. It's an English novelist, and he contributes to some quite highbrow publications in Britain, like the New Statesman, the Times Literary Supplement. He's got quite a high reputation as a literary writer, and he's also written this book, Jesus. He wrote it in the 90s, and this is actually my original copy, which I bought in the 90s. So even in those days, I was interested in the history of religion, and in particular Christianity. This book came quite well recommended. He's not a sort of devoted New Testament scholar as such, but he did some New Testament studies when he did his degree at Oxford University. He also went to Rugby Private School. So there's his picture. I think you'll agree with me that he looks probably fairly typically English. Well, it's probably, maybe you'll disagree, I don't know. But okay, so let's get on with the story. So the situation is that he was born in 1950. He went to Rugby School, then he went to Oxford University. He started off in his first year at university at seminary. He was going to be a priest. 1 year into that degree, he changed his speciality, and I think he studied English with some theology, and he also did some New Testament studies, and he began teaching English. He published a novel, I think, while he was still at university, that was quite successful, and he has actually published quite a lot over the years, and he's done very well. And to be honest with you, he is a very good writer. I found that this book on Jesus is exceptionally well written, very approachable, very readable. So I've got an article here. I'll put a link to it in the description. It's from the Mail, the Daily Mail, British newspaper, and he's writing about how he rediscovered Jesus. But in his 30s, he deconverted from Christianity. And then in his 40s, he wrote this book on Jesus. And I'm just going to quote to you out of it. I'm going to read out. I just should say to you that it's probably going to take me about 15 minutes to get through this. I do think it's worthwhile listening to this story, because you won't hear it anywhere else unless you go out and do your own research. And there's a lot of quite interesting things that come out of it. So he's writing in the preface here about why he's writing this book, and what he hopes to achieve and what he hopes to establish. And he's writing about his own sort of crisis of faith. I'll just read out this paragraph to you. So he says, like the majority of Christians, I swayed uneasily between these two positions for a number of years until they both came to seem dishonest. Forget that, it's referring to another paragraph. It is only fair at the outset of such a bold enterprise to admit my own position. For many years I was a practicing Christian and tried to avoid facing the implications of what I had studied when I read theology at university. As the years went by, however, and as I read more and reflected more deeply on what I had read, that would not quite do. I had to admit that I found it impossible to believe that a first-century Galilean holy man had at any time of his life believed himself to be the second person of the Trinity. It was such an inherently improbable thing for a monotheistic Jew to believe. Nor, having learnt how to read the New Testament critically, could I find the smallest evidence that Jesus had ever entertained such beliefs about himself, nor that he had preached them. Once I began to understand more about Paul and the audience for whom he wrote his letters, and the nature of the Gospels, I saw how important it was to study the situation in life, the Sitz im Leben, as the German theologians called it, of each of these New Testament writers. I began to see how it was possible that Paul might have invented the Christian religion. Though this is too simple a way of putting it, it was a slow and, in my case, as it happens, painful process to discard a belief in Christianity. And when I did not feel it was honest to continue to call myself a Christian, to attend churches which addressed Jesus as if he was alive, to recite creeds which acknowledged Jesus as Lord and Judge of the world. I knew that many of my fellow Christians shared my doubts, and have continued somehow or other to reconcile the practice of the Christian faith with the knowledge that it is founded on a fundamental untruth. But I could not do this. Okay, so that seems to me quite strong in terms of a rejection of his faith. He had not only given up, he hadn't simply given up his faith because he found it hard to believe these things with no research having been done. Just that, the Trinity can't be true. It's too complicated a God structure. No, he'd studied at university, and he was in the freshest state of his mind, the pinnacle of his intellectual state in his 30s and 40s. And I think he deconverted in his late 50s. But let's look at that deconversion, which I'm not exactly sure when it happened. I've got this article from the Mail Online. It's actually from 2009. So, and that book on Jesus was written in the late 90s. So obviously it's sometime between when he wrote the book and later on. But I've got some quotations from it, and I'm going to read them out. Just to tell you what the headline is. Religion of Hatred. Why we should no longer be cowed by the chattering classes ruling Britain who sneer at Christianity. Right, that's really kind of throwing down the gauntlet, isn't it? And he's got a picture of Richard Dawkins here, as you can see. So I'm just going to read out some quotes from it. So he's explaining why was he so dismissive of Christianity, what led him to this deconversion when he was in his 20s and 30s. So he's writing, why did I, along with so many others, become so dismissive of Christianity? Well, here's his reason. Like most educated people in Britain and Northern Europe, I have grown up in a culture that is overwhelmingly secular and anti-religious. The universities, broadcasters and media generally are not merely non-religious, they are positive anti. That is so untrue. That is so horribly untrue. This is a man who went to Oxford University. Now, for any of you who've been to Oxford, there is religion everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. I've been to Oxford. I've been into the chapels, and I've seen the faithful singing. And there is Christianity absolutely everywhere in Oxford. You can't get away from it. To say that the universities are anti-religion is absolutely unbelievable. Even the university that I went to, Nottingham University, it was a lot more secular than Oxford University. Of course it was, but there was still in the central university building where the Chancellor's office was and everything, and the Great Hall, it was all kind of built around Christianity. And the Department of Theology was in the nerve center of the university, right next to all the other so-called prestige subjects, history, philosophy, English. They were all there in the nerve center. So I don't really know how he can justify saying that. As for broadcasters, how many religious programs in the 60s, 70s and 80s did we see on the BBC? What about the radio? What about the broadcast of all the services? And on the television, we had songs of praise on Sunday. We've got all the religious holidays. It's absolutely unbelievable that he makes this excuse. I just can't agree with him at all. I grew up in the same culture as he did. Okay, he's older than I am, but I don't get that at all, that there was this anti-religious feeling. And in the university that he went to, it's a very Christian environment. He calls this, he says that I felt at some visceral level that being religious was unsexy, like having spots or wearing specs. This is a man in his 30s and 40s, a novelist, and at the height of his intellectual prowess, And he's claiming that these really trivial things, that he's such a weak character, that these trivial things, in my opinion, and really I don't agree with them at all, were so strong to him that he ended up abandoning his faith. I find that, I can't prove that he's being dishonest, but it smacks of dishonesty. This playground attitude, he goes on, accounts for much of the attitude towards Christianity that you pick up, say, from the alternative comedians and the casual light blasphemy of jokes on TV or radio. Actually, to be honest with you, there was one comedian in Britain who did make a bit of a joke out of religion. His name's Dave Allen. But the rest of the comedians, they generally stayed away from religion. I grew up in the same culture as this man, and I don't recognize the Britain that he's talking about at all. I mean, when I think about all the religion we had at school and how much reverence there was for the Lord's Prayer and everything, I just can't believe he's saying all this. Then he goes on, he rails against the anti-God fanatics, Hitchens, and the geneticist Richard Dawkins. Is Dawkins, strictly speaking, a geneticist? I thought he was an evolutionary biologist. It's different, isn't it? Yeah, okay, and he's saying that Richard Dawkins, they think that all the evil in the world is actually caused by religion. No, that's not true. They're not. They've never said that. He's straw-manning Hitchens and Dawkins. The vast majority of media pundits and intelligentsia in Britain are unbelievers, many of them quite fervent in their hatred of religion itself. I don't get this at all. You know, I followed media a lot in the 80s and 90s. And I didn't pick that up. And then he goes on, for 10 or 15 of my middle years, I too was one of the mockers. But as time passed, I found myself going back to church. Now, this is the interesting bit, because when people reconvert, I'm always interested in why. What are your reasons? Because maybe I've missed something. As time passed, I found myself going back to church, although at first only as a fellow traveller with the believers, not as one who shared the faith. I wonder why he was going to church. Okay, he was going to church with his friends because they believed and he didn't. That seems strange. So not as one who shared the faith that Jesus had truly risen from the grave. Sometime over the past 5 or 6 years, I could not tell you exactly when, I found that I had changed. Well, if he was going regularly to church, and that was kind of, that slow kind of subtle brainwashing was going on, maybe it's no surprise that he converted back. When I took part in the procession last Sunday and heard the gospel being chanted, I assented to it with complete simplicity. Oh, I don't believe it. My own return to the faith has surprised no one more than myself. Why did I return to it? I didn't go looking for Jesus, but I found him. Partially, perhaps, it is no more than the confidence I have gained with age. Well, this is the thing where you've got atheists saying, well, as I got older, I became wiser and I became an atheist. And you've got Christians saying, well, as I became wiser, I was an atheist and I eventually realized that the resurrection really happened. So, I mean, this thing about there's no fool like an old fool. I mean, age, about myself, some people have said, oh, Stuart, you're older than me, you're wiser. No, that's nonsense. You can have a 20-year-old being wiser than a 60-year-old. There are plenty of unwise idiots in this world, and there are plenty of unwise idiots who are young. It's not how old you are, it's how you use your brain. Right. Okay. So there is more to it than that. My belief has come about in large measure because of the lives and examples of people I have known, not the famous, not saints, but friends and relations who have lived and faced death in the light of the resurrection story, or in the quiet acceptance that they have a future after they die. You see, I don't know. It looks to me he's spending his time with other Christians, and he's seeing how, I don't know, maybe they've had cancer, maybe they've had difficult circumstances, and Christianity has helped them through. Yeah, I admit that. I know Christians who say that it helps them when times are hard. Yeah, I can see that, but it doesn't make it true, does it? And this is a man who wrote such a brilliant book on Jesus when he was 40 years of age. It's unbelievable. You should see the reviews for that book as well at the back. Okay. And it is true to say that no one can ever... now this is where it gets interesting, because he's trying to reason. And it is true to say that no one can ever prove, nor indeed disprove, the existence of an afterlife or God. Yep, absolutely correct. So why believe in it if it can't be disproven? And if it's unfalsifiable, it doesn't really classify as a proper hypothesis. Or answer the conundrums of honest doubters. Now you see how he's sneaky there, using the word honest doubters. It's like there are dishonest doubters, and he would probably class Dawkins and Hitchens as those. How does he know whether they're honest or not? And he's characterizing, he's got in brackets here, characterizing the honest doubters. A question they might ask: how does a loving God allow an earthquake in Italy? That's quite a sort of simplistic, the argument from evil, the problem of evil. Easter does not answer such questions by clever logic, nor is it irrational. Well, I don't know. I would probably put quite a case that Easter is irrational, given that the events which are narrated, which include a dead man coming back to life. On the contrary, it meets our reason and our hearts together, for it addresses the whole person. Well, he's just asserting that. He can't demonstrate that. It's just a bit of esoteric. He's just paying esoteric lip service to his religion. In the past, I have questioned its veracity. Yes, you did question its veracity, and you wrote a really good book, but you've abandoned reason and logic in favor of a fairy tale. Okay, so I questioned its veracity and suggested that it should not be taken literally. But the more I read the Easter story, the better it seems to fit and apply to the human condition. That too is why I now believe it. He's starting to sound there a bit like Jordan Peterson, that we can't prove that these things happened, and maybe they didn't, but because the narrative in a kind of metaphorical way suits what we call the human condition, accounts for it, and helps us feel better about this sort of existential suffering, that there somehow we can accept that the resurrection really happened. It's such sort of topsy-turvy, absurd logic and reasoning. He still writes good books, and he still contributes to columns, and he still writes well, but this is just, it's like he's put his brain, taken his brain out and put it somewhere and put porridge in its place and use that to think when it comes to religion instead of his brain. Easter confronts us with a historical event set in time. We are faced with the story of an empty tomb, of a small group of men and women who were at one stage hiding for their lives, and at the next were brave enough to face the full judicial. Now, he has studied, he knows better than this, he has studied in depth, and in his book he proves it, that there's really very little evidence outside of the Bible for any of this at all, and yet he's asserting this as historical fact. I did a video the other day on what happened to the saints, the apostles, how did they die, and I more or less debunked that we know that they were martyred. We don't know that at all, and we don't know that they were hiding for their lives. The empty tomb and the men and women, the early Christians, they were fearing for their lives. They may well have done, because there were purges going on against Christians at the time. So, okay. Anyone who believes in the truth must heed the fine points that such scholars unearth. But at this distance of time, there is never going to be so he's saying that New Testament scholarship is something that the faithful have got to look at and take into account. And then he's ruling it out. At this distance of time, there is never going to be historical evidence one way or the other that could dissolve or sustain faith. So at this distance of time, if it's virtually impossible to determine whether these events really happened, why would anybody believe them? So he's saying that you can't disprove these events and you can't prove them, therefore it's okay to believe. It won't dissolve anybody's faith. Okay, of course, only hard evidence will satisfy the secularists. Well, that's not true, people say that to me, oh, you've got to have hard evidence to be an atheist, or I haven't got hard evidence to prove the existence of God. I don't want hard evidence. I would like hard evidence. I don't need hard evidence. I need sufficient evidence to accept that the proposition is true. Whether that be hard evidence or some kind of other evidence that you've got, present it to me. He's straw-manning throughout the whole article. And in contrast to those ephemeral pundits of today, I have as my companions in belief such Christians as Dostoevsky, T.S. Eliot no less, Samuel Johnson, and all the saints, known and unknown throughout the ages. Now, what's that if it's not an appeal to authority? Another logical fallacy. And then he refers to Thomas More, who it was put to him that none of the bishops in England would stand with him at trial. And he said, well, I don't have any bishops, but I've got 100 saints behind me. And Wilson is praising, More, this wonderful. Do you know that More was torturing people? He was torturing people who were trying to translate the Bible. He was hanging, drawing, and quartering them, and he was taking delight in torturing them. Thomas More was an evil bastard. And unfortunately, because we've got this fantastic film, A Man for All Seasons, it is a brilliant film, does not represent Thomas More as he really was. He was a bloodthirsty religious maniac. Let's see. As a matter of fact, I'm sure the opposite is the case, and that materialist atheism is not merely an arid creed, but totally irrational. Well, he's not really presenting any arguments there to back up what he's claiming. Well, he's going to try and do here. Materialist atheism. What is materialist atheism? That's not something which... Atheism is obviously the rejection of theist claims. He's kind of combining two things here, isn't he? Amalgamating them. So materialist atheism says we are just a collection of chemicals. Well, I don't think that it says that. It has no answer whatsoever to the question of how we should be capable of love or heroism or poetry if we are simply animated pieces of meat. Well, that's sort of an argument from ignorance, that because we can't yet account for consciousness and how perception works and what happens, how it is that we love and we appreciate aesthetics and everything, because we can't scientifically account for all that, we might as well just go ahead and believe in God and accept Christianity after all. The resurrection, which proclaims that matter and spirit are mysteriously conjoined, is the ultimate key to who we are. Well, it might be the ultimate key to who you are, A.N. Wilson, but it isn't me. It confronts us with an extraordinary, haunting story. Well, I wouldn't say so. It's a human sacrifice. It's an unnecessary human sacrifice. Completely unnecessary. Which is supposedly to cleanse the sins of mankind, which is a really weird concept. Then he refers to Bach and great thinkers and writers who for the past 1500 years have believed it. So again, he's going with an argument for authority, that because all these great thinkers believed it, that's good enough for me, therefore I'm justified in believing it too. There's so much poverty of reason in this article. I just find it difficult to believe that. I'm almost incredulous that this A.N. Wilson is the same A.N. Wilson that wrote that book in the 90s. But an even stronger argument is the way that Christian faith transforms individual lives. Well, if this is the best argument he's got, he's saying it's an even stronger argument. Actually, he hasn't presented any arguments of any strength, but he says if this is even a stronger, the way it's transformed individual lives, the lives of men and women with whom you mingle on a daily basis, the man, woman or child next to you in church tomorrow morning. Well, what do you say about all the Muslims who say that Islam and Muhammad and Allah have also transformed my life? What he's saying about Christianity can be applied to Hinduism, Buddhism. How do we know those religions aren't true? Okay, so just to conclude, I'm going to bring this video to an end because it's been going on for long enough. I hope you enjoyed that, but I think that A.N. Wilson is just he wrote a really good book, and then he just trashed it all. He just threw out all the good work that he did. He deconverted for good reasons. He really puts the good arguments forward in this book. I know that New Testament scholarship has come on, and obviously scholarship about Jesus, but nevertheless at that time it was a good book. It's well written, very well researched, and he's just trashed it all and just thrown it under the bus, and he's embraced all this superstition and supernatural nonsense. And as I've read, you heard what I read out. Do you think there's much reason? Do you think there's much rational argument in this article, or any evidence at all for his religion? Okay, enough from me. I'll upload this and I look forward to your comments.